Thank you very much. Friends, I don't think Dr. Bettina Bauemer needs any introduction, but I'll now pass on the mic to her first to complete whatever was left from upstairs, but more than to go into the program and her papers. Dr. Bettina Bauemer.
It's not long enough.
We should be judged.
Kapila ji, Venerable Rinpoche, and friends. As Kapila ji announced, and we had already introduced it upstairs, I will also start with my personal association with Panikkar, and I think I'm the oldest, because for 50 years I have been very closely associated with Panikkar, as a student, as a collaborator, as a spiritual friend, and the beautiful word which we have both in Buddhism and in Hinduism is Kalyana Mitra, as a Kalyana Mitra. And out of these 50 years, for 25 years I have been collaborating with him, not in any official relationship of university assistant, but on the personal level of assisting him in various projects. And before giving a few examples of this kind of collaboration, I want to mention the way those who have known him, of course, it is nothing new, but the way he was working and the way he was communicating, it was so unique. He was both inspired and inspiring. He used to spend all his mornings in silence. And strictly nobody was supposed to disturb him in his mornings. And then when I came at 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock for the working sessions, he would have come up with some inspiration and some great insight. And his main suffering and problem was he had great insights, but he said, I don't have the language to how to express them. It was not only a question of English or Spanish or German, or he could think and write in any language. But he said, my ideas, my inspirations, I just don't have the language. And often he said, it has to be poetry, and then he was also not a poet in the real sense. So that was his suffering, that his very deep insights could not be really find the adequate expression. And then he would try to share his insight. And I was one of them with whom he shared many of his insights. And being there for 50 years, I have witnessed his tremendous evolution of his thought, and his openness, and his capacity to take in new ideas and new situations. And he was, in the true sense, a man of dialogue. There are many people who theorize about dialogue but who can't listen. But he was somebody, he could listen. And not only listen, he could take in the view of the other and then absorb it and then respond. So in that sense, he was the true man of dialogue. And we had so many dialogues. I was his student, in a way his disciple, but it doesn't mean that I agreed with everything. So we had some disagreements also. But he was stimulated, and then he came up with a response, and it was a wonderful, inspiring kind of working and living relationship. Now I just give a few examples of this kind of collaboration I had with him. One was, UNESCO had asked for his contribution to a volume on cultures and time. At that time he was very busy teaching, and then he said, Bettina, please, you collect the references, then we'll put it together and so on. So I had a wonderful chance to, for the first time, and then it continued with collaborating with Kapilaji, to search through the Indian tradition on concepts of time, right from the Atharva Veda to Bhartrihari to Abhinavagupta to all kinds of, and of course Buddhist sources and so on. So then when he came back from the States, then we sat down, and then this article was put together, which is in the volume by UNESCO on Cultures and Time. And time was such an important concept and experience for him, which he pursued, one of the most difficult concepts to be overcome in the intercultural context, because what separates us often are our concepts and experiences of time. So that topic continued. He wanted to make a whole volume. He gave me a whole lot of his materials on time. It never happened because the editing process, and he was always engaged in new ideas, new works, so one couldn't catch up. So that didn't happen, but now Milena Ji is there to put it all into that opera omnia. And then, of course, what I'm sorry, Dr. Karan Singh has left, but he very kindly mentioned the Vedic experience, Mantra Manjari. For 8 years, we were totally immersed in the Vedas. And it was such a wonderful experience. We were a team. It was a teamwork, and it was every time, a new discovery. Some text, I said, oh, we have to take this text, it's so beautiful. And then he would study it, then we would translate it, then we would edit and put it in poetic language. It was Mary Rogers who did it. And then I would make the notes, and then he would write the introduction and so on. So it was a complete teamwork, which we compared it also with the one verse of the Rig Veda, that's the rishis. They are creating those verses in a kind of, as a result of their friendship. And so it was a wonderful immersion in the Vedic world. It was not just Rig Veda, as Dr. Karan Singh mentioned, but all the Vedas, all the Vedic texts, including Bhagavad Gita. And you have to think that this was a pre-computer time. So that means writing by hand, typing, retyping, pasting, cutting and pasting and so on. We can't imagine how we worked on 800 pages manuscript without computer. So now I can't imagine, but it was an ongoing process, and not just the result, but the process itself was so. It was a learning experience and the sharing of the Indian tradition, and for him also a kind of discovery or rediscovery of his own Hindu tradition. So this was a great time on the Vedic experience. And I want to mention only one more field where we worked together very intensely, and that is on the works, especially the spiritual diary of Swami Abhishektananda. And we had a very difficult manuscript, 1,000 pages manuscript, and then to cut it down to 450 pages, and editing and selecting and making notes and so on. But that also, the process was as important as the result. And that was with him always. It was not only you produce a book, then it's the book, but the process, it's like on the pilgrimage way of speaking, every step is as important as the goal. So also every phase of producing these texts, these books, was as important as the end result. And because his inspiration was always there, it was like never boring, never, as who said this, the philosopher should be a very bright person, always a living thought, living and lived experience. So he produced his works by really an intense concentration, and that was his great gift. Intense concentration, then getting these flashes of insight, and then putting them into language as incomplete or as it was possible. But that process was wonderful to be involved with and to take part in. Yeah, there are so many more things to say, but I think this is just as an example for the kind of work we have been doing together. Now I come to the more objective part of my presentation. And here I must say, because Venerable Rinpoche is here, and we had in the last month, what, 2 months? 1 month? September, October, we had a wonderful conference on traditional use of education in Bir in Himachal Pradesh, and we were discussing on the works of Raimundo and his criticism of modernity and his views on tradition, etc. So this gave me the inspiration to present something on Panikkar's views on modernity and tradition. Let me start with a powerful text of Panikkar describing the human condition today. Quote, long quote. Once there was a man. Different from primitive man, this man had consciously lived for millennia. He had survived the avatars of history, and he had all the riches of the world at his disposal, yet it seemed that he had no hope. He could not stand any longer to turn his gaze upwards. He remembered the scant success of any type of progress, and the failure of all the humanisms in trying to liberate humans from their inhumanity. Wars, revolutions, and violence had disturbed him, and they solved nothing. All the sophisticated inventions of the human genius had since long become boring and monotonous, and all the lofty conquests of the human spirit had not succeeded in satisfying even the most elementary of human needs. And while the man was educated and well-fed, millions died of hunger, victims of injustice. The man was unsettled and unhappy. He was shaken, and he doubted whether the future would be bearable. He found the present intolerable, and he knew that his past was lost for him beyond recovery. Besides, he was aware that he could not return to the past, and even if he could, he knew well that he would not have liked to remain there. He had constructed a whole vision of the world, a worldview that some would call an ideology. He had reflected on everything. He thought of all things that could be imagined, and he discovered the powerlessness of reason alongside its justification. He could prove the existence of God, and equally could disprove every one of these proofs. He could discover life as full of meaning, but he could equally argue to prove its meaninglessness. He could conceive to solve all his problems with the help of technology, and at the same time he could show that this very technology was the greatest scourge that had ever befallen human existence. He began to suspect that what had been called freedom and democracy was nothing but an expression of human despair to find the truth. His thoughts began to waver. He felt the fear which would overtake him while doing one thing or another. It was enough never to think about the ultimate consequences of anything. Thus he was exhausted. He went in search of an icon, that is a divine image. He began to sing and to dance, to gesticulate, and even something similar to a prayer, inarticulate, arose from his being. Soon he fell asleep or he died. or he was destroyed by forces beyond his control. Nobody noticed his disappearance, and yet something had happened. End of the quote. This is a powerful metaphor, and more than a metaphor, of the predicament of modern man, conscious of the limitations of his reason and of so-called technological progress. In the face of the hopelessness and meaninglessness of the human situation, the way to overcome the contradictions is a return to the pre-rational world of symbol and ritual, mantra and prayer, connecting the man to another dimension that cannot be manipulated by human agency. Panikkar's sharp criticism of modernity is hardly known in India, or is known only to a limited circle, but its relevance to the Indian situation cannot be overestimated. Modernity is a very relative word. Relative because it comes from modus, mode, which in some languages like French and German also means fashion, something that is temporary and passing. Modernity has strong Western connotations, but Panikkar emphasizes that the concept should also be extended to other cultures which have their own respective modernities. But instead of following the pressures of the Western push towards modernity, quote, other cultures should not modernize themselves, but they should perhaps return to their ancestors, transform themselves, deepen themselves, or do something else. It is always the problem that with the best of intentions, we use words like development, modernity, progress, etc., as if every culture should strive towards these values which are so precious to the West. The aiming towards modernity is intrinsic to the West and extrinsic to almost all other cultures. Therefore, I am critical regarding the trend stating we should modernize. This is a Western idea. To modernize means adapting to the present times. But which time? Which present? End of the quote. Panikkar describes modernity by three basic factors: technocracy, secularity, and history. And his use of the term history as the myth of history. This is a big topic which I am not going into. Let me just briefly summarize these factors. Ever since the 1960s, Panikkar was deeply critical of what he calls technocracy. What would he say now, 50 years later? What with the tremendous changes to avoid the word developments of information technology besides the other aspects of technology? He distinguishes between techne, Greek, which also includes art and handicrafts, and modern technology, which is the fruit of one civilization, namely the Western one. Technocracy is consciously chosen by him to highlight the domination of technology over humanity. It is, quote, by reason of the evolutionistic and progressivistic mentality with which the modern West has attempted to justify consciously and unconsciously its world domination, all is evolutionary progress from the Stone Age to our Western civilization, from fire to electricity, arrows to nuclear missiles, a linear, homogeneous, with peaks and valleys of course, evolution mounts to the sky. This progress can of course be used for good or evil, as if good and evil were values fallen from the sky independently of precisely the ideology that seeks to justify these values. End of the quote. An essential factor that characterizes modern technology is the different notion and experience of time. Quote, technocracy has a time of its own, which is neither nature's nor that of the temporality or historicity of culture. Technocracy's time is technochromy and is based on acceleration. Human beings must adapt to this acceleration if they hope to survive in the technocratic world. The self-sufficiency of technocracy, which, of course, is more than applied natural science, inasmuch as it implies an earlier civilization, an entire civilization, reaches its culmination in nuclear energy, which is the unleashing, that is the accelerated expansion of the energy stored in the atom. This acceleration of energy creates the possibility, or even some would say, the probability of the extermination of the human species. End of the quote. The factor of secularity is quite clear, and it implies a separation from religion, the church, etc. The myth of history belongs to Panikkar's specific criticism of the domination of the Western myth over other cultures. One of his challenging theories is precisely the end of history, but I'm not going into this complex subject, and I suppose it will come up in the other papers. History, again, is a Western notion. Quote, traditional man in most cultures lives not in history, but in the cosmos. His life is reflected not exclusively or even mainly in human history, but rather in the totality of cosmic forces. Men know that they are children of nature and that they share in nature's lot. They come and they go, they are born and they perish. They belong to the universe, and only a small part of that same universe constitutes the historical development of their human fellows. This is a very important statement. End of the quote. Whatever may be its apparent power, a discerning eye like that of Panikkar can sense the lurking death instinct of modern technological civilization. Quote, as a matter of fact, Western culture, spreading itself thin over the planet, seems to destroy itself or fall prey to a death instinct. Yet other cultures appear somewhat powerless to contribute to solving or at least easing the human predicament of contemporary man. What colonialism has done to non-Western cultures and what neocolonialism is doing today in the name of globalization is to weaken or even destroy the self-confidence of traditional cultures. There is a constant attempt at self-justification in the face of this thin layer of modern Western domination. But it is precisely the contribution of traditional cultures which could help in solving the present crisis, provided they are conscious of their values. Let us first analyze some of the contrasting approaches of modernity and tradition. The concept of time has already been mentioned. The Western and modern idea of linear time and therefore of progress this has been mentioned. The traditional relation to time is embedded in cosmic and human rhythms. And rhythm is one of the favorite words of Panikkar, who even titled his last book, The Rhythm of Being. From his long elaboration on rhythm in this book, let me just quote these lines. Rhythm is the marriage of space and time, in the tantric sense that the one is the other. Time has become space and space time. You can distinguish them, but cannot separate them. Traditional cultures live with the cosmic rhythms and enact and reenact them in their festivals and rituals. Human life is rhythmically celebrated with its personal and social sacraments. In other words, secularized and technological time is in contrast to sacred and rhythmic time. In the article on time in Indian culture, which I wrote in collaboration with Panikkar, I ended with the sentence, no one in the Indian traditional culture is afraid of losing time because lost time is being regained. The most important contrast in the basic assumptions sorry. The basic assumptions underlie modernity on the one hand and traditional cultures on the other is that between dualism and non-dualism. The Sanskrit word Bheda would have been more fitting to characterize the post-enlightenment and technological Western culture than Dvaita. Bheda from the root bhed, to split, to cleave, to break, to cut, to rend, asunder, to pierce, and epistemologically to distinguish implies a split, a separation, a difference, whether between man and nature, spirit and matter, body and soul, as well as between human beings and societies. Modern science depends on Veda, distinction, analysis, dissection, up to the splitting of the atom. The basic dualism of subject-object is at the root of one of the greatest dangers, not to say evils, of modern civilization, making man an object. In The Rhythm of Being, Panikkar analyzes this attitude in terms of a devastating criticism of modern science. Quote, I'm sorry this is a long quote, but I think it's good to have in the background. Quote, the traditional criticism of the scientific paradigm consists in saying that it leaves no place for God, to which the scientist responds that there is no need for one. In contrast, my criticism of the scientific paradigm maintains that it leaves no space for man. The great absentee in the scientific mythos is man. Gods there are plenty, in the form of black holes, galaxies, infinities, great and small, limits, thresholds, and so forth. Devils are legion. Biomolecular sciences provide a virology quite as imposing as any medieval demonology. And modern, medicated man proceeds in fear and trembling in a world of invisible germs and viruses of all sorts. Matter and especially energy are all pervasive, as are time and space. Only man does not come into the picture. There is not an observer there, of course, a so-called intelligent observer who may even have programmed the computer and who doubles from time to time as the onlooker agog at what can be observed. Man, however, cannot be located among the data. It would be considered suspicious if the observer were found to be manipulating the information too much for the sake of a particular experiment. On the contrary, man is in a certain way the obstacle to pure information. One reckons with man mainly as a disturbing factor, a modifying parameter, necessary to be sure, but somehow obscuring the purity of the measurements. End of the quote. Man is an object, of course, and pertains also in the field of science. Everything man has, including genes, no, it's not the end of the quote. Everything man has, including genes, may be conveniently digitized, homogenized, and fed into the latest supercomputer, but this does not tell us what man is, or who man is, much less who I am. Modern science has been as wary of anthropocentrism as classical theology was of anthropomorphism, so that anthropology now seems to be afraid of its own subject matter unless it is reduced to sociological and scientific parameters. End of the quote. This is traditional Indian culture, which expanded throughout Asia, is based on non-duality, Advaita, Abheda. Panikkar is equally critical of monisms as of dualisms, and he is against the common translation of Advaita as monism. Monism carries the danger of all monoculturalisms based on one religion, one culture, one language, one nation, etc., which is precisely the sin of Western civilization. Non-dualism, or in his translation, a-dualism, I have to add precisely, and I will come to that. A-dualism is the only way to solving the crisis of today's world. Leaving the exclusive field of religion and philosophy, a-dualism must be applied in all fields according to Panikkar. Again, more fitting to the Kashmiri Shaiva concept than Shankara's Advaita, this a-dualism must have space for multiplicity, implying the interconnectedness of all things. In Buddhism, Pratitya Samutpada, in Shaivism and other systems, Sarvatmakatvavada. All is related to the whole. Every part is connected to the totality. Panikkar goes into great length to substitute the current translation of Advaita as non-dualism by a-dualism. Please tell me if I'm too. Good. Having translated Advaita as non-duality has had deleterious consequences in the encounter of cultures. The dialectical method is based on the principle of non-contradiction. If Advaita is non-dualism and at the same time claims to be non-monism, then Advaita is pure contradiction. Excluding any other plurality, we cannot escape the dilemma of either one or two without falling into contradictions. We cannot deny both one, not two, and two, not one, at the same time. It would amount to negating two and non-two. The only dialectical escape is simply monism, which is the great pitfall into which many interpreters have fallen when they interpret Advaita rationally, that is, dialectically. Advaita cannot be reduced to a concept. End of the quote. What is clear, however, that since the Upanishads, Advaita is not the conclusion of a syllogism, but the result of a mystical insight. My criticism is that besides justifying this translation, a-dualism, it would have been more meaningful to go into the different connotations of Advaita in the two systems, Vedanta and Prativijñana, which would have added to the clarity to which Panikkar was aspiring. I'm sure that many of you are going to speak on Panikkar's notion of tradition, and I should maybe skip something. The traditional conceptions of man are embedded in a holistic worldview and self-understanding, what Panikkar has developed extensively as the cosmotriadic vision, and we will have a paper on that. Modern views of man are based on dualism of man and God, man and nature, matter and consciousness, opening the doors to alienation, manipulation, and exploitation. According to Panikkar, it is only within a reintegration of traditional and medieval image of man, East and West, that a balance can be achieved. This would then be the basis for an intercultural dialogue which is not biased and which would lead to a reintegration of the cosmic and the divine in human life. The integration of tradition has to be based also on symbolic, intuitive, and archetypal ways of thinking. It opens the way to contemplation and mysticism. Contemplation, the greatest challenge to modernity, is, in his words, the very breath of life, and mysticism, the fullness of life. So I would have loved to speak on this. No, I think everybody's aware. There is another danger in the relationship between traditional and modern cultures, the exploitation of not only material but also spiritual resources. Quote, without idealizing archaic cultures, we should go against the inhuman aggressiveness of the industrial civilization. We have so far exploited the material resources of the pre-industrial world, and now we also want to profit from the spiritual values. Industrial culture is a superstructure of human life, and it is not necessary for a perfect, happy, balanced, and cultured life. These archaic cultures can help us to attain a simplification of life and to return to what I call the cosmic rhythms of the world. It is not a matter of learning some techniques, some spiritual techniques, like now you are practicing yoga to be a better manager or better businessman, which help us to function better in the industrial world. This could lead to a kind of prostitution of spiritual practices, utilizing them for our material benefit, and this is very much spread now. However, such a reintegration is not possible without a radical transformation of consciousness, the necessary metanoia. The solution has to be as radical as the problem is. Pluralism, and I'm sure there will be others speaking of pluralism, but at least I want to mention this at the end. Pluralism is an essential approach to the present situation, but it has to avoid the temptation of falling into a global alternative and into a decaffeinated pluralism. It's a very nice expression for a pluralism in which the specific characters of each culture are lost. Like decaffeinated coffee may look and taste like coffee, but it doesn't have the power. And to end with one quote, the great challenge of our days is a consciousness that is intellectually profound and that echoes the multi-secular experience of humanity, having also taken seriously other cultures, and which recognizes not only those pluralistic solutions which do not tend to reduce everything to a common determinator. This is precisely the failure of both monism and dualism, that they are easily understandable, but they are not adapted to reality as it is. So I'm sure the other speakers will come back to this question of pluralism. So this is only a hint at the importance of the topic of pluralism. Thank you.
Thank you, Bettina. You covered a vast area and brought up many questions at many levels. I think we can have responses for about 10 minutes and please identify yourself. I now know, but I have an eye problem, so 10 minutes, is that all right? No? Who wants to speak? Yes, Dr.
One more time with my dear friend from almost the time that we knew Panikkar together, and I've written about this in the Fecha for Bettina, how in a sense we had the same source but we took it in slightly different directions, and in my comments those different directions will be clear, because I am, while accepting your critique, Bettina, of modernity, perhaps more sympathetic to modernity, understood in a different way, and I'll invoke both Gandhi and Tagore as examples. Gandhi, certainly a traditionalist, but someone who saw that the idea of adapting is also a creative urge in us. We wouldn't be here in this very room if there were no sort of modernistic, in that particular sense. So instead of being so unremittingly critical of modernity, as A.K. Saran was, for example, both Gandhi and Tagore, it seems to me, were sort of selectively critical and selectively appreciative, because in a sense it was an important thing precisely in terms of the Western hegemony of the term modernity to come up with alternative modernities. And that was, for example, Tagore's great strategy was to say, no, modernity does not belong to the West. We can understand it in a very Indian way. And Gandhi as well, in spite of being perhaps more of a traditionalist, but both of them, as you know, were rooted in the Indian classics. In that sense, I'm just wondering, Saran is a very special, brilliant man, certainly one of India's greatest thinkers, and as Kapila-ji knows, someone whose thought perhaps needs to be honored. But in terms of Panikkar, given, as you say, his openness to new ideas, whether a more nuanced critique of modernity, especially in terms of seeing the great challenge of an Indian modernity, quite different from that of the West, might not be entertained. So that's my question to you.
Thank you. No, I don't want to respond. It's not take everyone, then you respond. Yes, Dr. Selvar, and then.
I'm a technologist myself, so I seem to think that science as well as spirituality, when I talk of spirituality, I talk of mysticism essentially. They are both searching for the truth, and their domains are different. the domain of science is the material domain only. There is no place for man there, because man is not like matter. He's not a dead being, conscious being. Consciousness is not part of science. It's outside the scope of science. Whereas mysticism has got a much wider, much more comprehensive domain, and therefore their truths are more comprehensive than the truth of science. But if you look where science arrived, the nature of the truths of the two are not much different. And I think that must be kept in mind. Thank you.
That's the last one, and then.
Just better.
I have just two observations or something to share with you about Panikkar way of thinking and how he can be taken in a creative way. First is about his relation with technocracy or technology. My impression is, but I would like to hear also maybe your opinion, is that Panikkar had sometimes, we had the image of Panikkar being very optimistic, very serene, a laughing person. And yet, many pages, especially in the beginning of his books when he writes introductions, or especially when he goes towards ecology and technocracy, are very dark, very pessimistic. He almost like wants to say, well, we are in that end as a humanity, as a civilization. Is there an exit? So that's what I'm pointing out. He reflecting on technology or technocracy and all of that specific distinctions he's doing in his speculative way, had a quite dramatic, if not tragic, vision of modern reality. There's something negative about that in his vision. Even if as a young Panikkar, sometimes he's talking about techno-culture. Young Panikkar, so-called, I called him, a first Panikkar, is can be sometimes optimistic. But when he gets older, and also when technocracy proceeded to develop, his vision about technology became much more dark. That's the one thing to how to understand Panikkar in chronological way. And my question is, I'm very into, personally interested in something which Panikkar did not. One thing he did not develop in his reflection about technocracy is digital world. He simply was too old. We had the digital revolution in 90s. Panikkar was already too old. He did not include this in a vast way in his way of thinking. But think about that. Digital revolution is something much bigger than probably technocratical revolution. But reflections of Panikkar about technocracy and technology, I'm developing something like a digital philosophy, or better saying, philosophy of digital world. That we all came here because we get emails, right? And so on. But there is something completely new that humanity has to face now, is this reflection on digital dimension of reality, the sixth continent, digital revolution, and so on. And Panikkar reflection of technocracy I find very useful, yet not sufficient about our reflection possible in the future with digital world, and how we have to deal with this from mystical point of view. Thank you.
Thank you. At last. Yes.
Just a question which I don't understand. The question will be about the question of this end of history, or this that idea that we belong to nature, and that nature is a characteristic of us, of space in a sense. But I think we belong also to time, and time is as much part of us. I don't know whether it connects with this question of the digital revolution or not, but I can't see how an analysis of the human reality can be satisfactory or complete if we don't realize or don't include this time-bound existence. Our existence is time-bound. So, do you take this out of the consideration of the philosopher or of the analysis, or do we find a meaning for the time-bound existence that we have in the explanations that you give?
Yes. First to Joseph. Of course, I have stressed the very critical aspects of Panikkar's criticism of modernity consciously. Because what you see today in India is not Tagore and Gandhi, but you see Western technocracy, I'm sorry to say, mostly. So that is why
me when you say Western techno.
So we wish that we had a Gandhian and Tagorean modernity. That I would wish, yes. And he also said when he some quotation which was very brief, you know, and also when he speaks about tradition, he said tradition is not something fixed; it is moving, and definitely it adapts, and and even by adapting, it also deepens. He says also passing on tradition is making it alive and deepening it. It's not stopping at some point. But definitely that kind of, what he says, modernity in terms of other cultures, that is welcome, because we cannot stop. As Gisbert also said, we cannot stop and we cannot go back. And in that simile also he said, you cannot go back. You have to find something here and now. And that here and now has to include both the traditional and the modern, because we can't escape that situation. But to encourage the other kinds of modernities which are not following the Western model, this was the stress I put in these quotations. And we just wish to encourage those other kinds of adaptations and integrations. Now, this links again to the question of Gisbert, precisely because there are different notions of time. And different cultures have, nobody's out of time, but different cultures have different experiences of time. And the historical dimension is a Western dimension. Historical in the strict sense of the term. But there are other notions of time, and the Kshanika Travada of the Buddhists and other notions of time, but nobody's out of time. But which time? That's what he's asking. Which time?
Because it's when you define historical time.
Yeah. So I wish somebody else would speak on the end of history, because it's a very big topic in Panikkar.
Yeah, has written a book on that.
Yes. And,
but the history was reborn after that book.
And I mean, your contribution was very useful, because it is true that negative, he became more and more conscious, and this revolution which we have now, that he has not been completely aware of it, because it was too late. So we have to see what we are doing here is also not just to reflect on his thoughts, but to continue, and to continue the reflection and to address topics which he may have not addressed, but in terms of his great insights.
Thank you, Bettina ji. I'll call upon, lastly, in a minute, may I take the liberty of making one or two observations on Bettina ji's paper, and just identify, I think, the structure of her paper, because naturally Panikkar is in the center, if there be a center. and his notions. First, the binary, tradition and modernity. And I think that we have both a statement and a presentation which will call for further reflection. He does go into the definition of both tradition and identify the semantics and the etymology of the word modernity. However, either the reader and those of us who are here and even in the disciplines of history, philosophy, sociology, everywhere, this kind of a binary has been set up. And the moment that binary is set up, there are a number of presumptions in regard to the word tradition and in regard to modernity. I will not say more on this because this is something that we should look at. Second, and very rightly, she has, and Panikkar's engagement with the notions of time. And in that, Bettina, you will remember, and I think somebody was there, and His Holiness came at the very end, dancing the seminar, which was an international seminar, Concepts of Time. And that is why I have taken pains to take out Panikkar's lead article, and we had some very heated discussions before that article was written on. And that's a complex thing, because we have then juxtaposed again two as a binary. We have talked about tradition equal to cyclic time, not equal to, but modernity or best linear time. And this is a whole world which requires further discussion. And in terms of the many notions of time, and I think that where then the third level, and I'll not elaborate on that, but your paper brings that out, is placing these two notions in terms of very difficult word, present. What constitutes the present? Very difficult. The most difficult is what constitutes the present, and in that present, who is that participator and onlooker into the notions of what have been semantically put as tradition, modernity, cyclic linearity. Because I think this is one level of the discourse that comes up. The other level of the discourse is at the level which I would not speak before such scientists, is the notion of, and pertinently, what constitutes science. And that brings up and you have appropriately talked about bhed and abhed and chindati, the word science in terms of that, and when we talk of, and the chindati versus the achindati, bheda and abheda. And I think that where then it leads you to the question of dividing to whether atom or neurons or neurons on the one hand, and the other which is trying to put together something. However, there is a third level, and that third level is the level at which are today the existential dilemma that we are living, we participating, we are the agents of it, and we are those who are interrogating it. And without making a divide between the Western and the Eastern, because those are geographical areas, and those geographical areas cannot be taken into the cognitive realm. And then there is the fourth, and this can't be mentioned here, as a question of power. And where we are captives in the power of the political and the economic, which takes you to the reversal of value, where we have devalued value. And that's the predicament. And I think your paper raises this, and as I heard it, I thought that perhaps this is the appropriate moment to make these remarks within Raimundo, but beyond Raimundo also. And we're not talking, when we say the digital, are we captives of it? Are we in command of it? So with these, because I thought this is fresh, and now may I request Professor Amaladass to present this paper. Thank you.
Very much, Kamlachi, for honoring me by sitting next to you. My paper is pretty long, but I will not read out all of them. Yes, I would read, I'll summarize it. But the main thrust of my paper, there are several overlapping, since we are all Panikkar scholars, so-called Panikkar scholars, that I granted. Okay. My main thrust is how religion, which is a source of violence, debated very much, how Panikkar's insight could obviate this source of violence. I'm trying to use Panikkar's insights into this debate today. I bring in several others, like Jan Assmann in Europe, and bring also Gandhi Ambedkar debate in our country to show the relevance of this. This is my main thrust. I hope I will succeed. You're all Panikkar scholars, you can correct. My interpretation is not correct. In this presentation, an attempt is made to look for a vision of Panikkar, if possible, a common thread that links all Panikkar's thought. To remain with Panikkar's choice of formulation of his own mission in life, one can trace back to one of Panikkar's earlier essays in 1979, titled Towards a Hindu-Christian Theology, with the subtitle Hrida Tattva. Significantly enough, his last book carries the title explicitly, The Rhythm of Being. Obviously, Hrida Tattva is a metaphor which sums up Panikkar's understanding of his life's mission. The metaphor stems from the worldview of Rig Veda, Hrida being cosmic order, which keeps the universe dancing in rhythm that governs the whole universe and holds it together. The last hymn of the Rig Veda sums it up, explaining what is meant by this rhythm. I quote in Panikkar's translation, book 10 of Rig Veda, 191 hymn, gathered together, converse together. I don't the Sanskrit, I give it in English. Yeah? United your resolve, united your hearts, may your spirits be one at one, that you may long together dwell in unity and concord. That is 191 hymn, book 10. Okay. Now, rhythm, harmony, concord are the key words of Panikkar's vocabulary. For he would like to highlight the interconnectedness of everything in the universe. He repeats this idea in different forms and finds parallel formulation, different traditions in the Greek perichoresis, the Buddhist notion of dependent origination, praditya samutpada, the basic philosophy of the Mallavadians, later taken over by Abhinavagupta, sarvam sarvatmakam, namely everything is interconnected, and the underlying principle of the cosmic solidarity in the karma theory. Panikkar accepts that all religions are ways towards freedom and happiness. He is not claiming to speak for any particular religion, Christianity or Hinduism, so he seems to distance himself from an exclusive loyalty to any religious tradition. He has taken the Buddhist symbol of Pratitya Samutpada as his motive, for as he himself says, a radical relativity of all that exists can only maintain a harmony without abuse of power, his own words. The reason is, I quote again, no single religion, not even all traditional religions taken together, has a monopoly on religion. But he participates in all the worldviews that exist, otherwise he cannot claim to understand really any religion or tradition which he talks about, whose texts and myths he translates and interprets. That is why you could say that he discovered in India that he was a Hindu, returned to Europe as a Buddhist without ceasing to be Christian. Now, how does Panikkar go about his mission of finding this harmony or rhythm of his writings? Panikkar formulates his mission as a thesis thus. On the one hand, I quote Panikkar, if Hinduism goes on in the traditional way without Christian input, it would run out of inspiration and become irrelevant. On the other hand, if Christianity goes on in the traditional way without Hindu input, it would become counterproductive and even dangerous. Thus, he means to say that both need to interact with one another in order to get enriched and find fulfillment. This process he calls cross-fertilization or mutual fecundation. He refers to St. Paul's theology as an example of cross-fertilization of Hebrew and Greek thought. So too, as Panikkar puts it, the Vedic world is another example of the cross-fertilization of the Aryan and Dravidian. The materia is Dravidian, octothonous, but the forma is Aryan, language is Sanskrit. So he pleads for a Hindu-Christian theology valid for both. All his other late works seem to go in the direction of realizing this dream come true. What did that mean for Panikkar and what it has involved for us? He was communicating a wider world, that means mediating between the East and the West, between Christian and Hindu world, as he was placed in a historical situation which was not his choice, namely inheriting the two worldviews, that of his Hindu father and Catholic mother. He was trying to be true to both these two traditions inherited, Hindu and Christian. Obviously, he was sharing the views of others as precondition for understanding the other. In his case, Hindu and Christian worlds were not foreign to him. He was not an outsider to any of these traditions, as he himself says. His major contribution publication, first one, was to discover the unknown Christ, unknown both to Hindus and Christians, by writing a commentary on the second Brahma Sutra, Janmatyasya Yataka. In 1965, he wrote that. He developed this insight of discovering the Christic principle hidden in everything in course of time, and comes out with a fully developed thesis in his book, Fullness of Man, Christophany. Even on his final journey in life, he wanted this double loyalty to be symbolized by part of his ashes being immersed in the Ganges and the other half buried in the family grave in Barcelona, and a Catholic Mass to be celebrated in Montserrat Cathedral. Though through the historical predicament, Panikkar had many natural advantages, exposed to different worlds, forms of faith, ways of thinking, exposure to different nationalities and training, but not without corresponding ambiguities and consequent tensions to live up what he said and what he did. But he was also trying to integrate and find ways of accounting for his belongingness to different worlds of faith. Brought up as a Christian, deciding to be a Catholic priest meant a lot to him, but did not want alienating his Indian family connection of his Hindu father. Obviously, he could not make a choice between father and mother. As a result, perhaps, he found a way to explain at what level he remains part of these two traditions. Now, in his own words, Philosophical Quest, he says, there are three headings he sums up, namely the existential venture, the intellectual burden, and the spiritual freedom. That is the last book, namely his Life and Words, is Italian published. The existential venture, he means, is the venture of a life at home in more than one culture and religion. In this process, he says that Indic teachings concerning one's personal karma, swadharma, became a new, valid, vivid symbol for him. He does not consider himself deliberately both Indian and European, both Hindu and Christian. He says, I quote, Instead, my birth, my education, my initiatives, my practical life have made me the person I am, nurtured by the basic experience of both the Western and the Indic traditions. Thus, I am participating on the one hand in both the Christian and secular realms, and on the other in both the Hindu and the Buddhist. He says, it took 3/4 of my life to be able to express this view with confidence. His interest in mythos taught him two things: to accept the dharma of his concrete existence. Secondly, taught him to dedicate himself to living a new kind of spirituality. Only praditya samutpada, the radical relativity of all that exists, can maintain a harmony without abuse of power. He takes that as his motto, praditya samutpada. He repeats it at least few times. Now, concrete way of living is mentioned. Panikkar was not an armchair philosopher fabricating a theory for world peace and harmony. He plunged into action, into the world of Hindu tradition, and interpreted and translated the text. I give only one example. Panikkar's usual explanation, understanding means to stand under the spell of the other. So, Panikkar was not merely making theological statements to justify his position, like some other expert who stand at the platform, discuss hours together without getting into the train. With a counter argument, they want to know, make sure where the train goes. Panikkar sees the urgency of the need to take the plunge, the spiritual calling earnestly, standing before a burning house, a metaphor from the Buddhist parable of the Lotus Sutra, to rescue the manuscript containing the message of salvation for mankind. There is an act of faith, the inevitability of the choice by allowing circumstances to guide his intellect, the spirit, and indeed his whole life. Obviously, I give an example. Bettina already pointed out how many years it took to translate that work. I mentioned this as his contribution. Why do I say this? This is not the first time Vedas were translated, but this volume made several people read, at least the Christians, many of them started reading Vedas because of this work. Now, he admits the Vedic epiphany belongs to the heritage of humankind. He seems to be aware of the identity of his identity as a Christian when he says, we do not want to hurt the feelings or invade the rights of the different religions of the world grouped under Hinduism. We do not intend to loosen the roots from their historical identity, but we believe that this rootedness does not preclude further growth. Panikkar writes a long introduction to this work, but then he considers, first of all, the introduction themselves as part of translation, he says. That's why he says you should read the introduction twice, before the text as prologues and after the text as epilogues. Only then you will understand my Vedas, my translations, he says. Now, why do I say this? Because I will skip a few things there. See, but translators are intercultural communicators, and they are global players, in my opinion. Panikkar says in his introduction, he says, the intention of this mantra manjari is not translation, but representation. That is, its goal is an existential reenactment. And he said the aim of this anthology is to make available to modern man the riches of the elders, and thus to globalize human experience. See, that's why, for example, the process of translation has been the challenge in India. Panikkar is not the first example. For example, Al-Biruni translated Patanjali Yoga Sutra and was trying to synchronize with the Quran. Take Tarashuko translated the 50 Upanishads into Persian, you see. And that was the work reached Europe through this translation. Later on, Duparon translated to Latin and back into German, etc., etc. It came to Europe. Missionaries translated the Bible into Indian languages, but they had a missionary trust. Panikkar has no missionary overtone or undertone. He did it as a scholar, trying to make it available to others. That's why I compare other people in this context. Now we come back to the third part, which I think is important. See, how do we place his theological position, namely Panikkar's position, related to the plurality of religions? This is an important topic I mentioned. Namely, amidst the multiple identity debate, Now, it is ambiguous to call simply a trans-religious theology in the statement is made. For what transcends religious realm cannot be called theology. Panikkar is against any absolutizing tendency, though relativizing one's position might sound too negative and so not acceptable to some people. Already in 1965, Panikkar writes that Christians have no monopoly of goodness, no monopoly of truth, no monopoly of salvation. 1965 in his work. It's in German, that's why Bettina is expert in German text and all these things. So what are the implications of his theological position in a pluralistic world of religions? Monotheism is said to be the presupposition for dictatorship or violence. This is obviously said that In India, there are 3,000 gods, but 33,000 gods. No such monopoly will come there. Okay. How does Panikkar's vision sustain this world of religions, which have the inbuilt violence potential? Panikkar makes a distinction between religion and religions in the plural. In his early 1965, that's a very important work. It's in German. I take a few points from here. He identifies 9 dimensions which constitute religion. Okay, it's a capital letter. And they can be mentioned briefly. I don't know whether I have to repeat. Many of the scholars will know that 9 sutras. You know, Panikkar is different. You know, the sutras will come always 9 sutras, and he writes the Bhashya commentary. He writes that. I'll just sum up at the end what I could in his own Panikkar's words. You know, in his own words, religion is a theandric reality which can only be understood if we consider human beings not as isolated, self-sufficient beings, but as mysterious, wonderful place of encounter in which God and the evil, spirit and matter, individual and society, person and universe struggle with each other and come together. Human being is no microcosm, but a megacosmos. And on the other hand, religions in the plural show an inner constitutive development towards the only religion, and all contribute to the enrichment of our true Catholic religion, whose only leading power is God, who calls from above all people of goodwill by truth, goodness and beauty, and draws to himself. There may be in the world of religion lights of many colors, but all proceed from the pure white ray. That would mean till not all colors meet together again in a new white ray, they are all ray particles, though one may be more intensive than the other. According to Christian understanding, the church is an inverted prism which restores the fullness of the human nature. The claim to be Catholic religion proceeds from the assumption that this religion has no special color but the white light. Panikkar also points out that plurality of religions can only have provisional meaning. Either this plurality exists for the time being, for a particular period of time, or it has no plurality at all, only because the religions have not yet reached their maturity and perfection. Panikkar's study was not to show that there is a historical dialectical development which leads all religions together and creates space for a single true religion. This development is still in the process. Panikkar also explained why he was using a Christian terminology, because he used a Christian principle. There was some objection against him, and he answers himself. He says, look, it is the only way to provide fuller expression to one's own thought in order to express that inner dynamic development, and integrating dialect is without any hidden agenda of Christian apologetics. If followers of other religions see theirs as the true Catholic religion, to explain the formal structure of these reflections which he made, as he has done it, they would have served Panikkar's purpose. But this genuine effort awakens the required spiritual competitive fervor which is needed in us, not to fall asleep on the way or to be pharisaically satisfied with our own thoughts which stagnate in our own group. End of the quote. Some others would like to emphasize the difference. For example, Albert Coutard, the French sociologist, he is so emphatic, I quote, in the world of the spirit, it is the clear differentiation which really unites without mixing up, while a uniform type of blurring the borders only separates in reality, because genuine values could never be exchangeable, never actually be equivalent. That is Coutard. But what Panikkar is trying to show is interconnectedness, in keeping with the vision of the rhythm of being. His concept of homeomorphic equivalent is an example in this direction. They are not identifying the concepts of different religions, but showing the functional similarity between them while granting the differences. This is the only way of showing how mutual fecundation or cross-fertilization of Hindu-Christian will take place. Being faithful to his vocation of creating a Hindu-Christian theology, Panikkar attempts to bring in specific doctrines of both traditions together. For instance, the Trinity of the Catholic Church, Christian tradition, is the core doctrine. The Advaita is basic to Hindu tradition. Panikkar calls them homeomorphic equivalents. He is not speaking on behalf of Christian tradition or for Hindu tradition. Moreover, you can say that Trinity is not exclusively Christian, and Advaita is not exclusively Hindu. He says that. In that Christian tradition, God is understood as Trinitarian. Panikkar says that not only God is Trinitarian, but the whole reality is Trinitarian. He admits that it is through Christian theology he came closer to the notion of Trinity, but his exposure to the Hindu concept of Satchidananda has strengthened his understanding of Trinity. This sort of mutual input has enriched his philosophical-theological vision of cosmotheandric intuition, we call it. Now, how do we formulate Panikkar's vision of reality? I call it religio triplex. You know, why I bring this phrase? Jan Assmann, the great well-known Egyptologist in Europe, in his recent book, Religio Duplex, writes as follows, I quote, "Everyone should practice his or her particular religion as if it is the true religion, in full recognition of the possibility that truth resides in another or much more, that the truth is hidden and all religions strive together towards it in their own way, since there is now and will be religion, only plural hereafter. This form of both true to one's own and at the same time respect for the other is a reasonable solution." That is Jan Assmann's position. Because he says the religio duplex, that is difference between universal religion of reason and the positive religions, there are several things. He also makes a distinction between these two. At the same time, as normative perspective for a proper self-understanding of religion in the global modernity. I quote, "In this form, this model fits in which the cultures and the religions of the earth are brought together in a way which does not allow any one of them to understand itself in the possession of the absolute universal truth as alone making holy, only as a religio duplex, that is the religion of two levels, which has learned to see itself as one among many, and with the eyes of the other, however, does not lose sight of the hidden God or the hidden truth as converging point of all religion, that religion has a place in our globalist world." That is Jan Assmann. Now, Panikkar, see, the religion duplex has its own difficulty, namely, it aims at complementarity between philosophically fixed religion of humanity, that is of reason, and the plurality of particular religions, which should not be eliminated, but somehow preserved in attitude of as if. Now, the as if is creating problem. I'll tell you why. Panikkar's position could be expressed in religio triplex, not duplex, a phrase I borrow from Schellshorn in his response to Jan Assmann. First of all, the first level will be the experience of the absolute nothing, the mystical level. Panikkar talks about the primacy of the mystic inexpressed needness of Christianity in several contexts. Secondly, interpretation of the absolute nothing, whether it's atheistic form, a religious form, out of which particular moral, political perspectives arise. Thirdly, rites and symbols, which are content-wise connected with this. Now, where do I find Panikkar? Does he say that? Yes, Panikkar says in another context, he makes three levels, namely the sociological dimension, where there is a fixed code of behavior, a doctrines, a belief system. Christendom, for example, we mean the sociological sense, the socio-historical crystallization of Christian development. In this sense, I cannot be a Hindu, Christian, Muslim at the same time. He's not talking about that. There's a sacramental dimension, church, for example, when we mean structure, which is not totally dependent on the sociological or cultural fluctuations, where there's a change taking place at the human level, and it cuts deeper into the human nature. We may, for instance, share the sacramental religiousness of others without belonging to it. The third dimension, calls it transcendental dimension, he calls it, example, Christ, which includes the above two, but you cannot manipulate this dimension, you see. This question remains at what level one relates himself as the others. The three divisions is valid in any religion, as Panikkar point out. The Christian world would call it Christendom, Church, Christ. A Buddhist will call them Sangha, Dharma, Nirvana. A Hindu will say Sampradaya, Karma, Brahman. And Muslim will say Ummah, Quran, Allah. So he is also trying to show this parallel to other traditions. This is how he calls it. That's why we call it religio triplex, I call it. Now, monotheism is always under suspicion of violence. The relevance of this consideration by Panikkar becomes clear when we look at the history of religions. In spite of all achievements by Judaism and Christianity, a new source of violence broke out, namely violence in the name of true religion, which targeted not only against outsiders, pagans and non-believers, but also against the insiders, namely heretics and schismatic. The potential source of violence in monotheist religion are many, such as the concept of revelation, which is a model of authority, and the traditional claims of revelation are a foreign body which make undue demand on the individual for a sacrificium intellectus, that is a quia absurdum. In the history of the positive religions, consequently it comes to philosophical self-exclusion of the concept of revelation, as it happened in the Middle Age Islam and Nicholas of Cusa, which in Islam led to marginalization of philosophy, and Christianity went to Reformation and Counter-Reformation, etc. This excess of so-called redoctrinization of Christian religion led to wars, etc., and led to atheism. Now, it's not out of place to bring Gandhi in this context, as expressed his voice against the dogmatic concept of revelation in the name of reason. I quote Gandhi, "I pronounce my judgment on every scripture, including the Gita. No historical text can enter into the place of my reason. Even when I accept the most significant books as a revelation, still I know they suffer from the process of double distillation. First of all, they are communicated by human prophet and then commented upon by the exegetes. Nothing comes direct from God." That is Gandhi. Now, our modes, how do we do it? The modes of sacred nucleus, they call it, are they relativizable? That's the point, you see. This is why I bring in Panikkar now. See, in order to make a balance between the absolute claim on the one hand and the interpretations by the positive religions, one can suggest the concept of sacred nucleus, this sakrale kern. You know, it comes already, Paul Ricoeur uses this phrase. Also, this German thinker, what's his name? Habermas uses this phrase, and yes, I bring in this concept here to fit in this context. Namely, in the sacred nucleus, the unconditional claim of the absolute nothing remains, is present. The sacred marks the border for discursive fusion. So what happens, you know, the concrete example, the sacred nucleus together with the resolving process of interpretations creates more tensions now. First of all, why the sacred nucleus concept is important? They are not historically stable, shift in multiple ways. The Exodus narrative in the Bible is a prototypical example of shifting of the sacred nucleus. The old Israelite prophets, for example, they desacralized partially the institution of the divine monarchy of the Pharaoh in Egypt, and at the same time took up the moral content of the Maat concept, namely the goddess of the righteousness in the Egyptian thinking, especially in support of the poor, widows, orphans, which was made sacred, sacralized by the prophets of Israel. In the shifting process of sacred nucleus, it would also come to a dangerous re-sacralization, as in the happened the protos Maccabees in the Bible. So this process of sacralizing or re-sacralizing is part of the nucleus policy. Even in Buddhist critique of the belief in the creator God and the caste system, may forms of ridicule and the abuse are to be found. In other words, the cultural development of mankind is determined by the shifting of the sacred nucleus, in which the desacralizing and re-sacralizing enter into one another. Secondly, or many other things. Now, this could be exemplified by referring to Gandhi. I come back again. Gandhi understands the concept of religion in a double way. Religion in the sense of concrete faith communities, for examples of various religions, and religion which transcends all concrete religions and which coincides with the truth. Religion in the second sense relativizes permanently, also purifies the concrete religions in the plural. By identification of religion with the truth, Gandhi removes not only the walls between religions, but also between religion and secular world. Even the secular world is rooted in the religion in the sense of Gandhi. Consequently, according to Gandhi, it has no meaning to change from one religion to another or to convert. The decisive task consists much more in the relativizing one's own religion in the light of the comprehensive truth, that is Gandhi. When one looks at the self-understanding of Gandhi away from the religio-political interactions in the Indian decolonization process, especially in the conflict with Ambedkar, it becomes clear that religious worlds are not so simple in the scheme of religious duplex of Jan Asman. For Ambedkar, for example, as Dalit leader, aggressively confront the sacred nucleus in the Indian caste system, which is supported by the authority of the Holy Scriptures, to maintain the caste system in the sense of as if, and at the same time relativize the name of the comprehensive truth, was thus not acceptable way. On the contrary, Ambedkar supports in all openness to change the religion. That was his way of doing it. On the other hand, Gandhi does not limit himself to an as-if model of relativizing Hinduism. In fact, in a creative way, took up a comprehensive revision of Hinduism. So he defends, for example, the principle of non-violence in the Bhagavad Gita against other types of interpretations, takes up these elements of Christianity and criticizes massively the Brahminic system. Gandhi also gives a clue in this direction. Now, conclusions. What did Panikkar do with the concept? So, Panikkar works at different levels in understanding the phenomenon of religion. At the initial stage, Panikkar tries to free from many misunderstandings in the Hindu-Christian encounter and desacralizes certain attitudes, sacred nucleus we can call it, in the Christian consciousness like idolatry, revelation, etc., etc. In his earlier essays, Panikkar talks about the misunderstanding involved East-West communication and as a result, Christianity and Hinduism did not meet at the intellectual, spiritual level. They spoke in parallel ways. I quote, "One does not speak the same language, and if one believes to have understood the other, at the end one discovers the vocabulary does not have the same meaning. The major concept, the underlying attitudes, the silent presuppositions, the originary moods are not the same. Even at the intellectual level, this misunderstanding continues." End of the quote by Panikkar. Then Panikkar gives some examples like pantheism and applied to Indian philosophy. Bettina already pointed out, monism applied to Advaita does not fit. Advaita highlights the basic attitude that the God and the world are not true, nor are they one, but non-dual, And the same way, irreality of the world, when applied to Maya, does not suit. Maya is a technical term in order to describe the uniqueness of the non-divine form of reality, which is neither being nor non-being, and as such cannot be grasped in toto, in statu quietis, in esse completo, but only in theory, in becoming, in statu viatoris, in esse imperfecta, I quote Panikkar himself, is something which cannot be placed along with Brahman on the same level as the absolute. It has no reality of its own. That is Maya. Don't translate as irreality, etc., etc. Another example equal to karma. The modern West is so proud of its discovery of the historical dimension of man, it has become almost blind to the recognition of the ontological and human historicity in the Indian karma. The past carries forward by the law of karma into the present, and the human solidarity finds an ontological historical bond. Many more examples, misunderstanding could be cited, Panikkar calls it, like avatara, etc., etc., idolatry. The idolatry, for example, presents a normal dimension of religious life, of human life. It's not consequence of the epiphany of God. Now, is it really idolatry that the prophets attack, or not much more the false idolatry that of the rival of Yahweh? The God of Israel is a jealous God. The Christian West, the heritage of the Jewish prophets, has always found a kind of instinct aversion against idolatry, which had the consequent tragic misunderstanding as Christianity in the modern time came in contact with the religions of Africa and Asia, says Panikkar. So Panikkar brings in the concept like secularization, tolerance, to relativize the sources of potential violence, dwelling on the fleeting nature of the sacred nucleus. Secularization, for instance, is seen as the healthy metabolic process by which a certain society gets rid of obsolete cultic forms in order to acquire new ones. This is how his secularization he brings in. This is his way of putting this, trying to use a sacred nucleus and destabilize a little bit. He offers even a non-exclusive interpretation of the infallibility claim. He a very touchy point in the Catholic tradition. He quietly sums up. He says that means a concern for the entire cosmos, humanity in particular, and a vision that sees the act of Christ in a universal perspective. Infallibility may thus seem as grand awareness that man now has the burden of this dignity. We are all thrown together in this adventure that propels us closer and closer to the perfect man, to the free reception of the Spirit, to be a man, fallible being who must believe himself infallible in order to survive. This is Panikkar's interpretation of the infallibility. The experience of we amounts to the realization of the Atman, Brahman. I quote, end of the quote. Now another concept Panikkar brings in here is the concept of tolerance. He has got 4 levels of tolerance in his book, Myth, Faith and Hermeneutics, namely political, philosophical, theological, and the mystical tolerance he calls it, which means, mystical tolerance means a non-objectifiable vision of the world and implies the conviction that every human act has a value that is not purely objective. This notion of tolerance implies that all reality is redeemable because it's never immutable. It also supposes the existential character of truth and the radical relativity of the personal being. Tolerance is the way one being exists in another and expresses radical interdependence of all that exists. End of the quote. At the second level, after clearing misunderstandings, Panikkar brings in the concept of homeomorphic equivalence, bridge between different religious traditions. His goal is to see harmony in living together. Convivencia, they call it in Spanish, okay? Granting the religious core in all religious interpretations without absolutizing any of them. Panikkar seeks to perceive the underlying unity. He thus highlights the harmony that prevails and that alone